my favorite activities is going to my local farmer's market. There I can check out all the fresh produce and even some of the fresh baked goods. But something that I've always wondered about is, do these farmers ever use GMOs? Which is short for genetically modified organisms. You decide to ask one of the farmers. They give you some information on the impact of GMO agriculture on society, government, science, and industry. Let's start by exploring how society interacts with genetically modified agriculture. For cultures around the world, food is incredibly important. Our historical perception of food is often as a luscious green field. However, maybe our future perception of agriculture will be food that's grown in a lab. One researcher that has experience in this area is Dr. Andreas Boecker. He currently works at the University of Guelph in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. His focus areas are GMO food perception, economics of food, and biotechnology communications. Dr. Boecker, would you mind telling us a little bit about your current research and how you got into this field in the first place?
Yeah, so by training, I'm an agricultural economist. My current research is about consumer acceptance of genetically modified foods. So that doesn't really fall into the traditional areas of research for agricultural economics. But the reason for that, for my decision, was that in 1996, when I just finished my PhD, the BSE or mad cow disease crisis happened in Europe. There was a lot of demand for research to better understand consumer responses to what experts said was a very small risk of being infected with the agent that caused the mad cow disease in cows, and also the uncertainty to deal with, because at that time it wasn't really clear. It was not known how the agent had gotten into the feed chain or into the animal. As you probably know, in 1998, the EU had a memorandum on the approval of or stop of the approval of any further GMOs, which became an increasingly public debate at that time.
Now let's look at a timeline on how Dr. Boecker got into this field. He started by doing his master's and PhD at Kiel University in Germany. Later, he worked at the Department of Agricultural and Food Economics at the University of Reading, before becoming a lecturer in agricultural policy and market research at the University of Guelph. So Dr. Boecker, what is the process of getting consumers familiar with genetically modified agriculture?
Synthesis of my own research, my readings, and also additional observations. So one thing that GMO really made very clear to consumers, but also to researchers, is that there had been a decade-long process which has sort of disconnected consumers, has increasingly disconnected consumers from agricultural production. So when you go back 40, 50 years, a lot of people in the Western world still had some ties or direct experiences related to agriculture, or they knew somebody who works in agriculture. This has changed very much, or gradually over time, that a very small share of people are actually only working in agriculture, and so the knowledge about agriculture has diminished at the same time among the general population. And GMOs, basically, or the public debate about it, impacted society in a surprise or shocking surprise way, how agriculture has changed from what old stories and old songs like Old MacDonald Had a Farm, and stories that you hear in school, in high school, and even kindergarten, how much agriculture has changed. And Health Canada in the approval process of genetically modified or genetically engineered products, and the risk perception and risk assessment of non-experts. And so that's something that impacted society too, because one could say it skewed the public debate about, let's say, modern agriculture very much towards the risk.
This discussion leads us to our first major question. What impacts do you anticipate GMOs will have on society's relationship to food? Now let's go have a look at how the government can interact with GMO agriculture. Let's talk through what some of the government's responsibilities might be. Maybe the government has to ensure that GMO farmers do not outcompete regular farmers. Or maybe they have to ensure that GMO crops do not harm natural crops. Or they have to protect the food supply in Canada. So, how do governments ensure that GMO crops are helping and not hurting the agricultural industry?
I think the most visible step is, or type of activity of government is setting the requirements, or that the government agency sets the requirements for approval of novel food products, which includes genetically engineered or genetically modified foods, or now with or modern breeding technologies more broadly. That, of course, provides a lot of leeway in terms of how these new crop or livestock products are being treated. So in Canada, with a case-by-case risk assessment, I think it's not yet decided whether gene editing is going to be in the same or will receive the same type of approval process. But in the United States, for example, there's a big difference in how gene-edited crops are assessed in the risk, and how or need to be, what evidence has to be provided for the risk assessment of gene-edited crops versus gene-edited livestock. And the sort of political priorities of individual countries are typically reflected in their regulation and the enforcement of regulation. And you see that in the EU, that the EU Food Safety Authority, which is in charge of the authorization process of genetically modified crops and livestock, they have the most stringent requirements. Yeah, a bit more complicated, but it's also very important in the context of especially genetically modified crops, is requirements for international trade. Yeah, and that is, for example, the EU has set a zero tolerance policy for non-GM, let's say, shipments containing any GM traces of GM crops in them. So there's a possibility to influence trade and what is being traded through these trade regulations on trade agreements.
One way that governments can get involved is by selecting what crops can be grown. For example, in Canada, we have GMO soybeans, GMO canola, GMO corn, GMO sugar beets, alfalfa, and GMO potatoes. This discussion then leads to our major question from our government section. What factors must government consider when making decisions regarding genetic modification of crops? Now let's look to see what the industry of GMO agriculture looks like. Let's look at who is involved. On one hand, we have the farmers who use the GMO seeds. On another hand, we have the biotechnology companies who are making the GMO seeds. And finally, we have the consumers who buy the seeds or buy the food. And as you can see, it is a cycle. The farmers influence the consumers who influence the biotech companies. With this cycle, there are a number of questions we may still be asking, such as who will benefit and who will be harmed, and how can we ensure that this is fair? All this being said, what even counts as the GMO industry?
the GMO industry is difficult to define, or you would say, well, there are different sectors in the use of genetic engineering, gene editing, in different agricultural sectors. And for example, in modern breeding efforts, a lot of public research stations and public research institutes are involved, for example, in the developing world, to produce adapted varieties that have a particular trait that is beneficial either from an agronomic perspective, for example, wilt-resistant banana in Central Africa and Eastern Africa, then the golden rice, which is, I think, still not approved. But we also have fruits and vegetables that are have been produced or have been bred by public research stations, public research organizations, and so that's all part of what could be called an industry. GMO or genetic engineering industry is in crops, so it's corn, canola, as probably the most, and soybeans as the three most important GMO crops in the world, which are have been developed and distributed by large multinational corporations. And these companies have their local or their breeding programs in individual countries, because the varieties still need to be adapted to the growing conditions in each country. And then, of course, they have individual research efforts in each of these countries, but you could say it's all centrally coordinated, because these companies definitely have a global perspective.
This leads us to the main question from our industry section. How are the potential risks and benefits of GMOs distributed between different types of farmers? In our final section, we'll explore the science of GMO agriculture. There are two sides to the science of GMOs. The first is the science of making the GMO seeds, and this will require genetic laboratory techniques. However, on the other hand, we have the science of GMO perception. This is Dr. Boecker's specialization, and he uses surveys, focus groups, and observational studies to determine these results. Dr. Boecker, would you mind telling us how research into the economics of GMO agriculture works?
For these type of studies, surveys are typically used, or where available, bookkeeping data. But that's, of course, because it's proprietary, that's very difficult to access. And it also would have to be linked with information about the adoption of the technology. So in essence, it's basically that, the evidence is in favor of the adoption of the technology, so that the income situation of farmers has improved compared to a comparable peer group.
This leads us to our final major question from the science section. What unforeseen impacts have GMO technology had on society, and what responsibilities do scientists have to tackle these issues? Now that we've discussed the impacts of GMO agriculture on society, government, science, and industry, do you think we should be using GMO crops? Thank you for watching this Gene School video. If you'd like to see more Genome BC educational content, go to genomebc.ca/education. Thanks for watching!